If there's one thing that defines all great Spider-Man stories, it's the theme of responsibility. The iconic line from the character's origin story sets Spidey on a collision course for dealing with this theme in all sorts of ways, and in all forms of media. One of the most popular forms of Spider-Man media is, of course, his appearances in blockbuster action films. And, of course, the theme of responsibility has followed Peter Parker into this medium, with varying degrees of success. With 4 separate film franchises, 3 actors playing the character in live action, and an animated movie that is considered to be one of the best ever made, Spider-Man has cemented himself among the great movie superheroes of the last 30 years. I've been aware of Spider-Man all my life, of course. In today's day and age, who hasn't at least heard of the Wall Crawler? The first movie actually came out a few months after I was born, but I never took an interest in Spider-Man, or superheroes in general, until summer of 2017, when Spider-Man Homecoming first released. I had a friend whose dad co-owned a local comic book store, and they'd managed to rent one of the local movie theaters for a private screening on opening night, so I was invited to tag along. Not only was Homecoming the first Spider-Man film I watched, and the film that got me obsessed with the MCU and ultimately set me on the path to becoming a film major, but it also ended up becoming one of my favorite films of all time. I'd of course heard the line,
"With great power comes great responsibility."
And I thought the film had played with the theme of responsibility beautifully. Fast forward a few years, and I'm an avid Marvel fan, watching a great deal of content about Spider-Man on YouTube. And the thing that surprised me the most was how so many YouTubers seemed to dislike the Tom Holland version of Spider-Man. Most of them praised the classic Sam Raimi trilogy, and claimed that the MCU version of the Wall Crawler didn't feel like the character should. And so, naturally, I had to go back and watch the Raimi trilogy for myself. And my overall first impression? For the life of me, I couldn't understand why people loved these movies so much. I mean, yeah, they had some great villains like William Dafoe as the Green Goblin and Alfred Molina as Dr. Octopus, but beyond that, I thought the movies were cheesy, the social scenarios Peter Parker was put in unrealistic, and the overall tone just felt off. As a result, I watched the first 2 and never got around to watching Spider-Man 3. So, fast forward a couple more years to now, and with all these rumors surrounding the next Spider-Man movie, claiming it will be a Spider-Man movie multiverse film, pulling all 3 of the previous live-action actors in, I thought it would be a perfect time to go back and give the older movies another shot. By this point, I'd already seen the first 2 movies of the Sam Raimi trilogy, and the Tom Holland films, and of course, Into the Spider-Verse. Additionally, my YouTube channel was finally starting to pick up steam after countless attempts, and I was doing mostly gaming videos, but I wanted to talk about something I was truly passionate about, like Spider-Man. So I thought it would be a good idea to do a retrospective of all the Spider-Man films, analyze each of their strengths and weaknesses, and ultimately offer a counter-argument to why I believe Tom Holland's Spider-Man is the most realistic portrayal of the character in film yet. However, when I actually got around to watching the Raimi trilogy, I found something that truly surprised me. I had actually started to enjoy them. I started to see what everyone else was raving about online, and while I still believe Tom Holland to be the best live-action Peter Parker yet, I think that the Raimi trilogy, as flawed as it is, definitely has its merits, and I'm convinced that the filmscape for Spider-Man would be completely different if it weren't for these movies being the way they are. So, without further ado, I present the first part in my Spider-Man movie retrospective. In this video, I'll be reviewing each film of the original Sam Raimi trilogy, saying what I liked, what I didn't like, and ultimately how they each tie into, or fail to tie into, Spider-Man's core theme of responsibility. I was originally going to do this all in one video, but then I realized I had so much to say about the Raimi trilogy that it would be best to split it into multiple parts. So this part will be all about the Raimi trilogy, the next video will analyze the Andrew Garfield films, and finally, the last video will detail the MCU films and Spider-Verse. So to make sure you don't miss those videos when they release, be sure to subscribe and click the bell icon, as it really helps the channel out, and just provides me a lot of encouragement to know people enjoy the stuff I make. Now, let's get into the first film of the original trilogy, and the first theatrical Spider-Man film, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. Now, I'm assuming most of you have seen these movies before, so I'm not really going to detail the plot from beginning to end. And if you haven't, well, I suggest you stop watching this video now and go watch them, because not only are they worth a watch, but this video is going to spoil all of them, and I don't want to have any of that blood on my hands. The first thing that stuck out to me about the original Spider-Man was that it does a really good job of establishing who all these characters are and what their relationship to one another is. For example, the field trip scene establishes Peter's feelings for MJ, and the fact that Peter is a social outcast from most of his class. But I think the best example of this is the scene with Harry and Norman in the car at the beginning of the film. This scene not only establishes that Harry wants to be seen on an equal level as his classmates and not alienated by his wealth, but it also establishes the tense relationship between Harry and his father that's going to play an important role not only in this film, but in the next few as well. Speaking of the Osborns, let's get this out of the way. I think that Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin, set a shining example of a well-crafted villain that almost all of the Spider-Man films after this have tried to emulate, to varying degrees of success. This, of course, is the concept of a tragic villain, which is defined on the All the Tropes wiki as a type of anti-villain and the ultimate deconstruction of the villain. A tragic villain is completely aware of their evil, but is unable to stop it, or must continue to do evil for other reasons. In the way that the Spider-Man films portray them, they are usually a good person, up until some tragic event happens, causing them to be set down a path of evil. In the case of Norman Osborn, it's of course his own ambition that dooms him. He volunteers to have the Goblin Serum tested on himself, and after the test is a failure, he is slowly driven insane, as his personality splits in two, and the Goblin ultimately wins out as the dominant personality. Throughout the movie, we get to see Norman struggling to comprehend the Goblin's actions, slowly changing from horrified to excited with each development, until he eventually fights Peter. And his last words...
Peter. Don't tell Harry.
Absolute perfection. I love the way he was handled here. I also love how his transformation basically parallels Peter. Whereas Peter becomes more heroic and selfless, Norman begins to submit to the Goblin's will more and more. The cinematography of this film is also very creative, and I love how over the top they went with everything in this film. One of the shots that stands out to me the most is, of course, the shot where the Green Goblin blasts away most of Peter's mask with a pumpkin bomb. And the cinematography during the Thanksgiving scene just helps to amplify the overall tension, making it one of the best scenes in the movie. However, the movie also has its fair share of cheesy shots, particularly during the fight scenes, where the choreography is basic but passable. Now, this is something about the film that I can't exactly place what the cause of it is, but the film just exudes a natural aura of nostalgia, and this is something that will apply to the entire trilogy going forward. Even though I never watched the film growing up, and it just feels so nostalgic, and as a result, the film just seems to get better every time you watch it. There's also some moments in this film that are genuinely hilarious, even parodying old superhero cartoons at some points. The film also excelled at setup and payoff, specifically with Peter coming to the realization that Uncle Ben was the closest thing he ever had to a father, after brushing him off at the beginning.
Was Ben Parker.
Unfortunately, not everything in this movie can be fantastic, and one of the other things I noticed early on was how cheesy the film can be. And though some of it is funny and can lend itself to some great meme humor in a modern context, most of it just made me feel disconnected from the movie as a whole, and brought me out of the immersion big time. Additionally, I feel like having Peter graduate high school halfway through the movie is a major disservice to the source material, as one of the most defining aspects of Spider-Man is that he's a regular teenager facing regular teenager problems. As soon as he graduates, the focus shifts away from Peter's problems in his normal life and makes it feel like the Spider-Man aspect of his life is just consuming all of it, because we never really see Peter struggle with balancing his classes and his crime stopping in this film. And the only time we really see him struggle socially is with his love for Mary Jane. His relationship with Harry is barely touched on outside of Harry being jealous of Peter for gaining his father's affection. Finally, Tobey Maguire's acting here is just not great. Whenever he plays the Peter Parker side of the character, all of the emotional weight to the scenes just feels very forced, and it overall detriments the movie. He also just feels a bit too old to play the character, though that might just be my own personal bias, because I feel like Peter should have stayed in high school for most of this trilogy, and Maguire appears to be more like a college senior. The rest of the casting in the film was phenomenal, however, the obvious one being J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson. This casting is all around perfection, and I'm so glad they brought him back for the current trilogy. William Dafoe as Norman Osborn is also great as well, along with Harry Osborn's casting. As for the theme of responsibility, the obvious choice would be to go with the whole "with great power comes great responsibility" theme, which does fit the movie pretty well. However, upon further consideration, I feel like this theme could be reworded in a number of ways that fit this specific film much better. The one that stuck out to me was this: use your power responsibly and not selfishly. Personally, I feel like this wording reflects the way the theme of responsibility is used in this movie much better, as it reflects the actions that led up to Uncle Ben's death. Peter tried to use his powers for selfish gain, and when he wasn't given the money he was owed, he let that selfishness consume him, ultimately leading to the death of the only father figure he's ever had. But throughout the rest of the movie, by using his powers responsibly and for the good of all, he's able to save the life of the woman he loves. All in all, I'd say that the first film in the original trilogy was a good start. Not perfect, but there was a lot of room to grow, and it was also the first successful attempt to make a Spider-Man film. And I think that the strong antagonist, the fun action scenes, and the lighthearted humor helps to pull this movie together. And while this movie gets its fair share of praise from most Marvel fans, many agree that its sequel, Spider-Man 2, is one of the greatest superhero movies ever made. Do I agree? Well, let's get into that. The first thing I noticed upon turning on Spider-Man 2 in particular was the fantastic score, which is something I forgot to mention in the previous movie. But here the score shines far above what the original was able to do. Danny Elfman scored both this and the first movie, and the work he did in both is stunning, though I personally prefer the sequel score. One of the things the sequel does best is its pacing, knowing where to have a slow moment, but also being able to pick things up rather flawlessly. There's a good balance of fast-paced and slow emotional moments in this film, and it helps to keep the viewer from losing interest or losing track of the plot. This movie also has another leg up over the original when it comes to its humor, having even more hilarious scenes than the first one, and the impact they leave is much greater.
Pizza time.
Which gives this film a solid, lighthearted tone compared to the way the original struggled in this area. Additionally, while the CG animation was very dated in the first Spider-Man, and is still pretty bad in some places here, there is one area that you can tell most of the budget went to: Doc Ock's arms. They're not always CG, of course, but whenever they are, it's almost indistinguishable from the actual prosthetics used for some of the shots. Speaking of Doc Ock, while he is often cited as one of the best Spider-Man villains in film, if not the best, I'm personally very mixed on him. While I do like the fact that he's yet another tragic villain, and the way the arms control him is truly horrifying, I feel like his personal shift in morality and attitude happens way too fast. I understand that the inhibitor was supposed to prevent the arm's AI from controlling him, but we go from seeing him being hesitant to steal the money in one scene, to gleefully teasing Spider-Man as he traumatizes Aunt May and tries to murder her. And then again, at the ending when he gets his redemption, it seems to come out of nowhere. The fight choreography and general cinematography are about on par with the original, with most of the shots being pretty good, with a few that were extremely cheesy, like the death of Doc Ock's wife and the doctors who tried to remove his arms. Some of the best shots include when Peter was losing his powers, and the shots from the perspective of Doc Ock's arms. That brings up something else I wanted to mention: Peter losing his powers as Spider-Man. This is easily the aspect of the movie that I dislike the most. There is almost no purpose to having Peter lose his powers in the story, and the way it happens just makes no sense. Peter's powers aren't like Thor's, where as soon as he's no longer worthy, they get taken away. Peter's powers came from a change in his own body, a change that, realistically speaking, wouldn't be able to be reversed like this, and certainly wouldn't just randomly come back as soon as he decided to become a hero again. This also leads into another pitfall of the film, being the romance between Peter and Mary Jane. I know I said I wanted to see Peter struggling with the same problems as real people have, but the execution here is just flat out awful. He stops being Spider-Man and tries to get with MJ, who's already engaged to someone else, which is a big red flag in and of itself. But then as soon as he gets his power back, he tells her he doesn't have feelings for her. Like, I don't care that he's Spider-Man. The fact that Peter is doing this and he shows no guilt for it makes him completely unrelatable, and actively makes me dislike him, which is a big problem when he's the film's protagonist and supposed to be a hero. And it's a real shame too, because the beginning of the film makes him feel like a very relatable character, much more than the first movie did, but the entire ordeal with MJ just ruined it for me. In addition to this, Tobey Maguire's acting as Peter is much too lighthearted for some of these scenes. It works for the humor, but in the case of the scenes that are supposed to be serious, like his scenes with MJ or when he goes to interrogate Harry, It just feels like he's setting up for the punchline of a joke when it's not supposed to, which drags the film back in my eyes. Also, this is a little bit of a nitpick, but as amazing as the entire train scene was, are we really supposed to believe that no one on that entire train who saw Peter's face outed him as Spider-Man? I seriously doubt there wasn't one person on there who would have been happy to reveal his identity to someone like J. Jonah Jameson, even if he did just save their lives. Real people can be super ungrateful, even in situations like that, so just thinking that not one person gave away his identity is too much for me to believe. The theme of responsibility in this movie is also extremely confusing, as it starts out with Peter giving up his responsibility as Spider-Man, and then eventually taking it on again. So one might think that the theme is don't neglect your responsibility, which is a theme that only really works in very specific circumstances. But then he ends up hooking up with MJ at the end of the movie, so maybe it's trying to say strike a balance between your responsibilities and the things you want? Either way, it just didn't work for me, and is a far cry from the very solid theme of the first film. Spider-Man Far From Home does a much better job of portraying a similar theme, but we'll get to that in its own video. Spider-Man 2 is a tough case for me, because there's a lot of aspects I really like, but it seems like for everything I like, there's something else that ruins it for me. I can definitely see why people praise this movie, but to me, the bad aspects make me much prefer the original film, even if this one had much higher highs. Now, when it comes to Spider-Man 3, most people know about the controversies behind the scenes, with Sony forcing director Sam Raimi to include Venom when he really wanted to focus on the Sandman as the film's main villain. But I'm going to be completely ignoring that in my review, as I believe films should be reviewed based on their own merits and not the controversy surrounding them. This film was another journey of highs and lows for me, though possibly not as much as Spider-Man 2 was. I think the beginning of the movie is one of its strongest aspects, and it does a very good job of pacing things out, and establishing our characters and where they are. It establishes Peter's relationship with MJ, his strained relationship with Harry, as well as his acquaintance with Gwen Stacy. We also get some establishment for Flint Marko, giving him a relatable side to his character, and, in my opinion, making him the most sympathetic villain in the Raimi trilogy. He was a man who stole money to pay for his ailing daughter's treatment, and while his actions are unquestionably wrong, his motivations make him a sympathetic character, and you genuinely feel bad for him when he ends up being involved in the accident that turns him into the Sandman. However, his motivations to keep doing what he does unfortunately deteriorate toward the end of the movie, leaving his arc on a sour note. One character I wish they would have established in a similar way is Eddie Brock, who, of course, eventually becomes Venom. The Venom storyline is easily one of the sloppiest parts of this movie, having its initial setup right at the beginning of the film, only to disappear until the 2/3 point. And what sucks most about this is that I feel like the Venom story really had potential. It was just handled very poorly. They could have split the Sandman and Venom storylines into two separate movies, while stretching Harry's story between both, and I feel like that would have given them much more time to put all their effort into doing their best with each arc individually. However, I do think that Harry's storyline as the new Green Goblin is handled very well, and the setup that was established through the small scenes at the end of the first film and throughout the second is paid off here in some pretty great ways. Having Harry lose his memory does seem a little contrived, but by the end of the film where he eventually decides to help Peter and fight off Venom and Sandman, I feel like his arc was rounded out effectively, and his sacrifice was well done. I also liked a lot of the cinematography in this one. It feels a lot less cheesy in most cases compared to the first two, barring the occasional Harry! I especially liked the way that the flashbacks to Uncle Ben's death were done. Additionally, I feel like Tobey Maguire finally started to portray a much better version of Peter Parker in this film, acting-wise, which is a shame, seeing as this is his final film playing the character. However, though the cinematography is much better, the film's overall tone is completely out of whack, being even more cheesy than the first two films. Additionally, there are some major scenes in this movie that just feel very out of character, in particular when Peter kisses Gwen at the ceremony. This feels very out of character for Peter in general, and it would have made much more sense if it had been something that happened once he was infected with the Venom symbiote. The way this film fails the most, however, is that it seems to completely abandon any theme of responsibility whatsoever, which, in my eyes, is the greatest sin a Spider-Man film can commit. No matter how I look at the film, I can't seem to glean any real theme about responsibility from it, which I believe is partly why this movie is so disliked. With that said and done, however, I can't say that I didn't enjoy watching it. It definitely isn't a bad film, it's just mediocre. And a mediocre film can still be enjoyed. So, all in all, what did I think about the Raimi trilogy now that I've seen it in full? Well, I can definitely see why people love these films so much. I think that for the most part, they had some fantastic antagonists, did a good job of spreading the narrative and character arcs across multiple films, and excelled at making Spider-Man feel heroic. However, overall, I think the area where these films struggled the most was at portraying Peter Parker as a regular person, and his struggle to balance his life as Spider-Man with his life as Peter. This is, of course, a key aspect of the Spider-Man character, which is why I think I didn't enjoy these movies so much when I first saw them. At the end of the day, I enjoyed them, but they're certainly not my favorite version of the character in film. But whether you agreed with me or not, I hope you can see my perspective on these films and agree to disagree, rather than grab the pitchforks, gather your angry mobs, and hunt me down for having an opinion that dare be different from the majority. In any case, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like, and if you have anything you want to add, leave a comment so we can have a respectful discussion, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next time I upload one of these. I'm also currently playing through Hollow Knight, and once they release, Persona 5 Strikers and the Hawkeye DLC for Marvel's Avengers, so if you're interested in any of those, check out my Twitch or the highlight videos here on YouTube. You all have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you next time to review the Andrew Garfield duology of Spider-Man movies.